Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Fullerton Hotel this morning for the fourth IISS Fullerton lecture in the 2013 to 14 series. I'm Tim Huxley. I'm Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fourth event in the current series of Fullerton lectures in the ballroom of the Fullerton Hotel in the middle of Singapore's financial district. As many of you know already, the spirit and purpose of this lecture series is to inspire informed and intelligent public debate on matters of international importance from an international perspective. And what happens in India is certainly a matter of great international importance, not least from the perspective of countries in India's own region. So I'm particularly pleased and we're honored to have with us this morning as our latest IISS Fullerton lecturer, His Excellency Mr. Manish Tiwari, Minister of Information and Broadcasting in the Government of India. Manish Tiwari is one of India's younger cabinet ministers. He was educated at Punjab University in Chandigarh and at the University of Delhi, and he subsequently practiced law at Delhi High Court and in the Supreme Court. He was president of the National Students' Union of India in 1989 and the Indian Youth Congress I from 1998 to 2000. He was elected to Parliament in the Punjab constituency of Ludhiana in 2009. As a parliamentarian, he came to prominence when he moved a private member's bill to bring the intelligence agencies under parliamentary oversight. And he has been Union Minister for Information and Broadcasting since October last year. Mr. Tiwari, we look forward greatly to hearing you speak this morning on the topic of reviving the India story, policy priorities for a Congress government, following which you've kindly agreed to respond to questions from the audience here in the ballroom of the Fullerton Hotel. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Huxley, the Executive Director of the IISS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you, Dr. Huxley, for inviting me to speak to this August gathering. In a short period of time, the Fullerton Lecture Series have established themselves as a signature event. The galaxy of eminences who've spoken here bears eloquent testimony to the preeminent position of the International Institute of Strategic Studies as one of the foremost thought platforms of the world. Let me begin from the beginning. What, after all, is the India story? What are the contours and parameters within which we are trying to locate the India story? What time frames are we talking about? Since its liberation in 1947, India has been an unfolding tale of 1 million mutinies that have been imploding on its mosaic on a daily basis. Zillions of ambitions and aspirations that bubble up every day in the hearts and minds of more than 1 billion people who are the permanent cast in this story. It thus becomes imperative to locate and anchor this milieu in its broader historical context. Even a narrower focus on India's growth trajectory in the past 1 decade would be incomplete and perhaps misleading if we do not take into account the factors that have molded and shaped the policies India has adopted, as also defined and determined the path it has trodden. The idea of India has baffled many thoughtful gentlemen in the past too. Prime Minister Winston Churchill could not imagine that India was a single Westphalian entity any more than the equator was. Since independence, the warp and the woof of the India story has been consistently woven by the Indian National Congress around a pluralistic society aspiring for equity in the policy frameworks of governance. The India story has been, by and large, consistent with this vision and understanding of India since the Indian National Congress has been heading the government for almost the better part of time over the past 66 years, except perhaps intermittently for a little over a decade when other political formations were at the helm of the ship of the state. As we engage in this conversation here in Singapore, a round of provincial elections are playing themselves out concurrently, and national elections are scheduled for the April/May of 2014. However, to discern the policy priorities for a Congress government in its next term, it is imperative not only to rewind to 2004 and objectively evaluate the past 9 years of UPA's rule, but to first delineate the core contours that define the India of today. The first of these contours is, of course, demographics. India is a young country with increasing capacities, both among its employable and the employed population. When this dividend is declining among some of the other hyperpowers of today, say by 2033, India would be peaking and plateauing on this score. It makes eminent sense, therefore, to remain engaged with India. The second is the increasing efficiency of its working paradigms. A 21-year-old who started his career in 1991 now has 21 years of experience in a neoliberal economic order. They are now more than acquainted with modern technology, foreign companies, and above all, a market-driven domestic dynamic. The third contour is better companies. Indian companies are increasingly becoming both capable and competitive. The trepidation that our corporate institutions are archaic monoliths that would collapse in the face of global competition has been replaced by a sanguineness manifested by Indian corporations in a plethora of sectors. They have not only become conglomerates, but are rapidly acquiring companies in the emerged economies also. The fourth is an increasingly robust financial order. India invests 35% of its gross domestic product every year. Steps are being initiated to reinforce the financial system by emulating best practices that global financial systems have on offer. The objective being to convert good investment to GDP ratio into a higher rate of GDP growth. The fifth is enhanced economic integration. India is now engaging with the world in a humongous manner. Gross flows in the current account are now 63.3% of the gross domestic product, and gross flows in the financial account are now 55.3% of the GDP. This fructifies into cross-border flows of 118.6% of GDP. This makes India one of the more permissive economies in the world. Engagement with the world brings in its wake a flow of ideas that invigorates our intellectual landscape also. The sixth is liberalism and democracy. A liberal democracy that anchors both the rule of law and an institutionalized judicial system. Democracy ensures that issues which resonate with an overwhelming bulk of the people engage the collective energies of the policy community, and liberalism ensures that there is space for the last man in the last row to live his dreams without fear of discrimination or bias. Coupled with this is the new phenomena of the social media, which has completely transformed and changed conversations in India. From a top-down discourse driven by extremely opinionated, though sage policymakers, the entire paradigm in the last 5 or 7 years has now come to resemble a more bottoms-up communication or a more bottoms-up conversation. So therefore, you have, at the last count, about 80 billion people on Facebook, on Twitter, and who are growing rapidly by the day. And this is something which has given the ability to young people especially, both horizontally and vertically, to be able to participate in the public discourse. And nothing, perhaps, has brought about such an exponential transformation in the quality of our public discourse. Of course, there are certain people who tend to call it anarchic than the phenomena of what is called the new media. Since it falls to my remit to deal with it on a daily basis, I can tell you it's possibly the most enriching and enlivening experience to be able to contend with an experiment in anarchy, which has ended up succeeding for all it's worth. Now let's turn to evaluating the performance of the UPA over the past 9+ years. There are broadly 5 parameters on which any democratic dispensation can be benchmarked. They are as follows. The first is political stability. Since entering an era of coalition politics in 1991, India saw a fair amount of fluidity from 1996 to 2004, an era that saw non-Congress governments and coalitions at the center. However, if one was to juxtapose those 8 years with the 9+ years of UPA rule from the May of 2004 till now, you would discern that political instability as a thought construct or a concept has almost but disappeared from the terra firma of the Indian public discourse. This is the bedrock that has facilitated a silent revolution of empowerment that has engulfed India over the past decade, the specifics of which I would elaborate later on in this presentation. The second is social cohesion. The idea of India has been underpinned by the core values that constitute the philosophical construct of natural rights and humanism. They are the fundamental freedoms of thought, expression, religious beliefs, democratic choice, and a variety of others that fall within the remit of this overarching construct. The India that the UPA inherited in 2004 was scarred by a state-sponsored pogrom perpetrated against the largest minority in the West Indian state of Gujarat. Coming on the heels of the religious polarization perpetuated in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, using Indian mythology as an anchor, it put a severe strain on the pluralistic ethos of India. One of the foremost tasks of the UPA government when it came to office in 2004 was to reassure its citizens, and especially the minorities, that their life, limb, and liberty would receive the fullest protection of the Indian state while persevering to bring the criminals who had implemented this pogrom to justice. For the true test of any democracy, ladies and gentlemen, is not how you treat your majority, but rather how you treat your minorities. Over the past years, the UPA government has been successful in mitigating fear, maintaining peace, and mainstreaming the minorities. This has resulted in the dissipation of the perception of a nation at war with itself. Again, this has provided a fillip to economic activity, as both the people and the state have been able to concentrate their attention on bread and butter issues. The third benchmark is internal security and its external linkages. India still faces serious challenges to its internal security, both in the northwest from cross-border state-sponsored terrorist activity, as well as in the northeast, where ethnic insurgencies receive external patronage. Coupled with this is the problem of left-wing extremism in central India, where the bulk of our natural resources are concentrated. The United Progressive Alliance government, through a combination of hard power and soft power initiatives, as well as capacity augmentation measures, has been able to keep the security situation stable despite grave provocations. The worst, of course, being the Mumbai outrage of 2008, ironically, whose 5th anniversary was yesterday. Unfortunately, the accused who perpetrated this assault continue to enjoy the generous hospitality of our neighbor. With triple transitions coming up in Afghanistan next year, the security situation in South and West Asia requires responsible engagement by all stakeholders. Similarly, in the Eastern Theater and the broader Indian Ocean region, the string of pearls and other such exotically disruptive paradigms would only serve to make the global commons more volatile rather than secure the global flow of goods and resources. The fourth benchmark is economic development. In the past 9+ years, the UPA government has constructed perhaps the most ambitious and holistic rights-based social infrastructure. The right to information, guaranteed 100 days of employment to the rural poor, free and compulsory education to each child below 14 years of age, the most comprehensive school lunch program that feeds 120 million children daily, food security for over 800 million people, forest rights to the indigenous people, and the overhaul of the antiquated land acquisition laws. The list of initiatives is breathtaking in the trinity of its scale, conception, and implementation. All this was actioned without sacrificing growth. The UPA government has delivered an average rate of 8.1% GDP growth over the past 9 years plus. The mantra of equity with growth has been captioned and the talk has been walked. This was achieved despite the arbitrage, derivatives, and leverages, the ADL cocktail of 2008 that mauled the new economic order down to its very fundamentals. After 4 stellar years of growth from 2004 to the September of 2008, growth did slow down in 2008-9, but India quickly rebounded from the slower growth rate of 6.7% in that year to record rates of growth of 8.6% in 2009-10 and 9.3% in 2010-11 respectively. Unfortunately, there was yet another upheaval in the global economy in 2011 on account of the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And that resulted in the subsequent slide of global economic paradigms. Concurrently, India also has to confront domestic constraints on investment and consumption. As a corollary, growth declined to 6.2% in 2011-12, 5% in 2012-13, and the current account deficit widened to US dollars 88 billion, or 4.8% of the GDP in 2012-13, though indications now suggest that we would close this fiscal with a current account deficit of about 3.8%. A sharp downturn in manufacturing growth and a quantitative decrease in the service sector further deaccelerated growth in the first period of 2013-14 to 4.4%. India's economic indices during this period are not an exception, but unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, are part of the current norm. Most developing economies have been hit by the phenomena labeled by economists as the Great Descent. The silver lining, however, is the manifestation of the green shoots of recovery in the badly affected Eurozone economies. Anticipation of an upward swing in the economic trajectory of the US, coupled with the backbenching of quantitative easing, has generated hope of a gradual global revival. The Indian economy has also showed early indications of recovery with an increase in exports in the second economic quarter, which ended on the 30th of September, reversal of negative growth in the manufacturing sector, rise in freight traffic, a generous monsoon, and a sharp increase in the sown area, which would fructify into enhanced farm output. Numerous reform measures over the past 1 year should also start fructifying from the second half of the current fiscal, translating into the expectation that the Indian economy will grow at over 5% and perhaps closer to 5.5% in 2013-14. Juxtaposed against the global economic context, even a growth rate of 5% should qualify for more than an E for effort. However, our first and foremost policy priority would be to return the growth trajectory to the commanding heights of the previous decade by expediting pending financial legislation as well as other policy initiatives which would ensure the top tracking of this process. The final benchmark, ladies and gentlemen, is of course foreign policy. In the past 9+ years, one of the significant achievements of the United Progressive Alliance government has been the strategic positioning of India's interests. in the evolving churn of global developments. India has successfully engaged with the US, Russia, China, EU, Japan, the ASEAN, other global powers, multilateral institutions, and of course its own region, managing contradictions without being overawed by the responsibility that the movement to multipolarity portends. Notwithstanding the Asian rebalance, the continued emergence of China as the lonely, or the tumultuous events in the Middle East, the moral imperatives that form the bedrock of our foreign policy have not been diluted, but perhaps tempered with the pragmatism of the times that we live in. In the past 9+ years, the task of national reconstruction has been almost frantic, to say the least. Let me enumerate the steps taken to improve the Indian financial architecture in the past 1 year itself. A commission of theoreticians and practitioners has drafted a new Indian financial code, a legislation drafted to replace 50 existing laws governing finance with a single concurrent financial statute. A brand new Companies Act is already now in place. Commodity futures, which were earlier dealt by the Ministry of Agriculture, are now dealt by the Ministry of Finance. If I'm correctly instructed, perhaps even in the United States after the ADL crisis, they have not been able to manage this transition so far. A new law has been promulgated establishing the defined contributory pension mechanism under a statutory regulator. Therefore, with an overwhelming sense of humility at the strides that have been made during the last 2 consecutive years of the UPA rule, the obvious question that begs an answer is what must be the policy priorities of a Congress/UPA government in 2014 if people indeed do give us this opportunity once again. And one of the difficulties in trying to juggle responsibilities as a minister and as a politician and to be here for this very august lecture is that you get to write presentation in parts. So therefore, there are some notes which I made on the way to Singapore, and I updated them during the day, which unfortunately are in the file out there. So I'll have to just zip across and grab it. You'll have to just give me just a minute to, yeah, we've got it. So therefore, the first and the foremost task, if I would put it very simply and in perhaps a single sentence, is to ensure that we translate the progress which has been made over the previous decade to build a state that is able to deliver to the expectations of an empowered, ignited, transformed, connected, but yet a very restless young India. The first and foremost challenge is then to ensure that India transcends from a low middle income to a middle income country. This would require liberalizing our economy further to attract FDI and FII inflows. This in turn means ensuring that an environment is recreated where it is easy to do business and to ensure that profit is not made to sound like a dirty word in our public discourse. This is the only way to ensure that 10 million plus young people, the flower of a democratic dividend, are gainfully employed every year. Coupled with this is, of course, a special emphasis to quickly put in place the remaining building blocks of the financial edifice, namely the Direct Taxes Code, the Goods and Service Tax legislation, banking and insurance enactments. We've been able to do the pension regulator, the dual tax avoidance agreements, the tax information exchange agreements, to name but a few. The second, and perhaps the most critical challenge for the Indian state, ladies and gentlemen, is to build capacity of the state to build the capacity of the state to be able to effectively address, surmount, and yet nurture the opportunities that emerging frontiers have to offer in the decades to come. A state that can deliver public goods and services efficaciously. The third challenge, of course, or the third priority, is a concerted attempt to completely overhaul India's colonial administrative system so that vertical and horizontal talent intake are created at every level of government. Perform or perish has to become the new administrative mantra of India. The fourth, of course, is the rewriting of a panoply of century-old laws with an expiry date attached to it to synchronize them with contemporary realities that adequately empower the instrumentalities of the state to implement these covenants by putting in place mechanisms that put a premium on both performance and accountability. One of the biggest challenges that we have in India, and that was what we've been trying to address over the last decade, is to plug the last mile. The last mile meaning that when goods and services leave the doorstep of the government and they actually arrive in the homes of people. And this last mile linkage, because of possibly diversity and the geographical spread of India, is something which we've not been able to surmount. And this, to my mind, would be the foremost public policy priority of hopefully a UPA or a Congress government in its next tenure, to ensure that we are able to get a fix on this last mile linkage. The fifth priority would be to create capacity in the judicial system at all levels to ensure that delivery of justice is efficacious and swift. The sixth is to make it unambiguously clear to our public institutions that policy choices and their execution are the eminent domain of democratically elected governments. And during the question and answers, I will hopefully elaborate further on that. The seventh is to work for the reform of global institutions to reflect the current global realities and not the post-World War II power balance. The eighth is to augment institutional wherewithal to protect our national interests, both on land and the high seas, from both state and non-state actors. The ninth is to work with like-minded nations to prevent and preempt the militarization of outer space. The 10th, of course, is to redouble our efforts at global disarmament. And in this context, we welcome the accord with regard to Iran's nuclear program, which was signed recently. The last but not the least is to fix our politics and regenerate the spirit of multi-partisanship on critical policy issues so that our legislative institutions remain relevant to underwrite this transformation. As we look to the next 2 decades, India requires space for consolidation to action the above elucidated menu of priorities. That means tranquility on our borders, stability at home, and a militant but secular leadership that can engage at home and with the world in a spirit of partnership and not demagoguery. India's path of inclusive growth rests on the principles of social justice and equity, peace and harmony, pluralistic understanding of the social reality, and a celebration of India's diversity. This, ladies and gentlemen, in brief, is an attempt to present a snapshot of what I think is the real India story, coupled with our policy priorities over the next 5 or 10 years. And once again, Mr. Huxley, I would like to thank you and the IISS for giving me an opportunity to make this presentation here today to such an august and an enlightened audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that excellent and very, very wide-ranging speech. I won't attempt to recapitulate your main points because there were many, but I suppose there were 3 key elements in your address about the real India story. The first was to look at the factors underlying India's successes under the UPA government over the last 9 years. And secondly was to measure the performance of the UPA government against a list of benchmarks in some detail, and then the natural progression from that. Thirdly, to look at the policy objectives of a future government if re-elected next year and going into the future. So that was very wide-ranging, looking at the past, the present, and also optimistically towards the future. I think our audience is going to have a lot of questions to ask you about what you said, and also other questions about India's place in the region and in the world, as well as domestic policies. Could anyone who'd like to ask a question please raise your hand, and then once I've identified you, the microphone will come to you, so please stay where you are. And once you have the microphone, could you please say who you are and who you work for or what your affiliation is, and then please ask your question as briefly as possible. First of all, gentleman at the back.
Darren Riley from CLSA. What can this government do within the next 6 months to kickstart a new investment cycle in India?
I think you've possibly articulated a question which has been uppermost in the minds of all policymakers. And therefore, if you were to look back over the past 1 year, while the growth trajectory slowed down because of both external and internal factors, we have consistently attempted to put in place an architecture which could facilitate this process. We began by addressing the concerns which the global investment community had with regard to retrospective taxation. In fact, as a lawyer and as a tax lawyer, I can tell you that though there is no equity to tax, but to try and retrospectively overturn judgments of the apex court is possibly not the wisest thing to do, and therefore the first thing that we've done is to reverse that and send out a signal to the investing community that insofar as the judicial landscape is concerned, we will ensure that all judicial decisions are honored in their entirety. The second thing that we have done is to put the pension regulator and the contributory pension paradigm in place. We already have about 6 million people who subscribe to this entire architecture. The third thing that we are attempting to do is to see that in the upcoming winter session of Parliament, which commences from the 5th of December, we fast-track both the insurance and the banking legislations, which have been hanging fire for a while. So, therefore, I think, with these measures, we would be able to resend the signal that the UPA government is committed to returning the economy emphasis on fiscal prudence, notwithstanding that this is the penultimate year of the government before we go into elections. We deliberately eschewed the path of any populism by cutting down on government expenditure and also ensuring that we try and restrict the current account deficit, as I mentioned earlier, to about 3.8%. There are figures which are available which actually benchmark it much lower, but we'll keep it at about 3.8%. Coupled with that, of course, is also an attempt to see that the core sectors of the Indian economy, which unfortunately because of activism, litigation, have slowed down in the last 3 or 4 years, essentially mining, infrastructure, roadways, road construction, the bottlenecks on this are removed. We've put in place a cabinet committee on investments, which is looking at each specific project each specific large project which has an economic impetus to see as to how the roadblocks can be obviated and these projects can be put back on track. So there is a variety of measures which have been taken, and we are seeing that now fructifying because economic activity across the board has started picking up once again. So according to me, a combination of all these measures would be able to kickstart the investment cycle.
Thank you very much. Mr. Surya.
I'm Surya Narayan from the Institute of South Asian Studies. What, in your opinion, should an ex-new government in India in 2014 should be doing to address the issue of corruption in public life in India on the domestic front, and to reimagine, if not reorder, relations with Pakistan and China in particular? Thank you.
Two big questions.
Well, your first question with regard to rent seeking, and I was actually anticipating as to somebody would point out that I deliberately chose not to address that in my presentation, but I unfortunately have a different take on that. And the reason I have a different take is because if you look at, like you have headline inflation, if you look at the headline allegations of corruption, they emanated out of one of our public institutions, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, who wrongfully claimed that as a result of a policy choice which the UPA government had made, the Exchequer had incurred a loss of 28 billion US dollars. Now, coming as it did in the November of 2010, it completely disrupted public discourse in the country. It had an impact on governance. It also had a domino impact on the investment cycle, which the earlier question had referred to. But, and the crux of the Comptroller and Auditor General's argument was that if we would have allocated spectrum, which is used for telecommunications, if we would have auctioned spectrum, which is used for telecommunications, rather than giving it at an administered price, the Exchequer would have gained. Subsequently, there was litigation, and the licenses which were awarded were cancelled, which of course has led to attendant complications because a large number of people have invoked BIPAs, the bilateral investment protection agreements. But be that as it may, when the auctions took place, what did they result in? Ultimately, they resulted in an inflow of 1.22 billion US dollars to the Exchequer. Out of that, only $210 million has really come up front. The rest is going to come over a period of 10 years with a 2-year moratorium. And if you juxtapose it with the amount that the Exchequer had received upfront through the administrative or the administered allocation route, which was $2.37 billion, it has a lot to say with regard to the very superfluous allegations of rent seeking, which have been very irresponsibly bandied about by public institutions in the public space. And that is why I reiterated that one of the foremost tasks for any government would be to tell public institutions in India that policy choices and their implementation are the eminent domain of democratically elected governments. However, having said that, I do not take away from the fact that there is no rent seeking. There is rent seeking which takes place at all levels. It is a challenge which needs to be addressed. And the most efficacious method of addressing that challenge is to possibly harness technology and to make interface processes between government and the people as transparent as possible. Because if you look at India, out of the 1.24 billion people, about 800 million still live in rural India. where their interface with the state is actually either at the level of the police station or with the revenue authorities. That is the cutting edge where rent seeking really needs to be eliminated. Coming to Pakistan and China, well, we've been making an attempt to try and build bridges with Pakistan. In fact, the UPA government, especially Dr. Manmohan Singh, our Prime Minister, has been wrongly accused of trying to walk that extra mile, notwithstanding very grave provocations by Pakistan. Juxtaposed with that is the reality that the sentiment against Pakistan is very hostile on the Indian street. So therefore, if we need to really build a stable and a sustainable dialogue with Pakistan, I think the initiative will have to come from them to rein in the non-state actors, which still continue to use their territory. A starting point of this, and this is purely my personal view, I would not like to bind the government of India, is that given the triple transitions which are coming up in Afghanistan, possibly India and Pakistan can have a serious dialogue, if not about bilateral issues, then at least about Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan, because that's going to be the one more critical piece in the enduring stability of the region. And with China, I think we've, over a period of time, notwithstanding the irritants, have managed to evolve a fairly stable relationship. Yes, there are problems on the border, with regard to what is the border and what is the perception of the border, but we've not allowed that to stand in the way of building a very stable economic relationship. There are large Chinese investments across the board in India. Similarly, Indian companies are present in fairly large numbers in China. And as we look to the next 2 decades, I think it is prudent for both India and China to realize that they will not be able to change their geography. So it's much better that if we change our chemistry with each other.
Just in the middle here.
Hello, I'm Priya, and I'm here in personal capacity. You spoke about a liberal democracy being the contours within which the India story is written. And a big part of that is personal freedoms, or the personal freedoms that are given to the citizens of India. And in the past 2 years, we've seen many challenges to that personal freedom, many of which come within your direct remit. The first one being the CMS, which essentially gives the government unbounded leave to put surveillance on people. The second one being the misuse of Article 66A of the IT Act. What is the priority of, what would be the priority rather of the next UPA government potentially to address these challenges and impediments to personal freedom?
I think after starting life as a project in the Defense Advanced Projects Laboratory of the Pentagon, the internet has perhaps been the most successful experiment in anarchy, and it has succeeded. Never before, possibly in the history of mankind, so much power has been available to so many people at so many different places. It today represents the largest space on largest ungoverned space on planet Earth. What you are seeing really is a tale of 2 civilizations. A physical civilization that has evolved over the millennia, and a virtual civilization which is evolving. And it is the interface of these 2 civilizations which really brings about that inflection point which you talk about. You see, I have heard arguments on both sides, the absolutists who want freedom of the net to be absolutely unfettered. However, to those absolutists, I would like to pose the question that at what point in time does a tweet which is essentially a form of digital freedom, really become a public broadcast, essentially a telecommunication service, which then should be subject to some reasonable restrictions. Because the reason why I say that is that while I completely take your point that every liberal democracy needs to ensure that these personal freedoms are protected, but the state also has a responsibility to secure the life and liberty of citizens. And in the last 1 year, we've seen 2 such incidents in India: the exodus of people from the northeast, from South Indian cities, which was the result of paranoia which was created on new media. Then the recent communal riots which took place in the central Indian province of Uttar Pradesh, where again morphed images had a very large role to play. So therefore, you need to find the right balance. And the right balance is going to emerge if global rules of engagement with regard to the new media, are institutionalized quickly. And the reason why I say that with all responsibility is because in the absence of those global rules of engagement emerging, the states would be tempted to then tamper with the hardware which really underpins this, the internet or the new media phenomenon. And like we saw the rise of the net during our lifetime, you would actually maybe see the balkanization of the net, balkanization along the lines of global value systems, maybe an Anglo-Saxon net, a Sunni net, a Shia net, or maybe even in terms of Westphalian spheres of geographical influence. So therefore, the whole question of internet freedoms is not merely whether 66A is used or abused, or whether 66A, and we've raised the bar with regard to that. I mean, now no complaint can be registered without it being approved by an officer of the level of an inspector general. But there needs to be a far more serious global conversation on this entire phenomena that we have created over the past 10 years.
On the right here, thank you.
Minister, my name is Archie and I work for a bank here in Singapore. A couple of quick questions. You mentioned about the program and coming from Punjab, I'm sure you would appreciate the single biggest program in history of India was the 84 rats, anti-sequence, and the perpetrators still, scot-free. And the body count is not exactly in favor of Congress over the last 60 years in terms of communal rats. So you view on that. And second one is, if you're in opposition, would you be a responsible opposition given the kind of disruptions that you've complained against the opposition having the last couple of years disrupted the whole governance process? So what's your view on how you as an opposition would behave in the next parliament? Thank you.
Well, let me tell you, the equivalence which people try and draw between the 84 riots in the 2002 program is absolutely erroneous, for the simple reason that the Indian National Congress has never ever attempted to even justify what happened in 1984. It is not only the 1984 riots, but between 1980 and 1995, unfortunately, a large number of people, both Hindus and Sikhs, perished in a militancy which was completely unnecessary. And some of us who carry the personal scars of those 15 years can possibly testify to the complete unnecessariness of that entire process. So therefore, that equivalence, is completely erroneous. 84 was as bad as any other such incident which has taken place in any other part of India. I'm not going to make a distinction as to how 2002, because it was state orchestrated and sponsored, is far more reprehensible. The short point that I was trying to make that the India that we inherited in 2004 was extremely polarized, extremely divided, with the minorities extremely unsafe, with a sense of fear palpable across the length and breadth of the country, giving an impression of a nation at war with itself. And that's why throughout those NDA years, you see the average growth rate between 1999 to 2004 never went above 5.8%. 5.8% is the average which they touched. So therefore, that's the bit about the first part of your question. With regard to the second part of your question, you see, we would obviously wish and hope that given the solid track record of performance over the past 10 years, the UPA is given a third term. But if people do decide to the contrary, then I think our track record speaks for itself. If you look at the track record of the Indian National Congress, whether in the Assembly where it sits in the opposition, even today, because in India's federal polity, the fact is that most of the parties which sit in opposition in Parliament are actually governing in various states. And the one commonality across the board is that the Congress is the principal opposition in most of the states. So therefore, our track record in opposition, speaks for itself. So therefore, I don't think on the count of responsibility, you really have anything to worry about.
Sir.
So my name is Anupam. I work with Citibank and I also study with RSIS. My question is, it's about policy priorities. So do you have any policy in consideration to allow the NRIs, the non-residential Indians spread all across the world, to cast their votes during the elections?
Well, we've already passed an act which allows you to do that. There is an act which we passed in 2010, which allows that if you are a person of Indian origin who holds an Indian passport, you can go and register yourself on the electoral rolls of wherever you are from. There is a process to do that, and then you can vote.
My question is, can the vote be casted from abroad?
Can the vote be cast from abroad? I think, well, that's a logical second step which can be looked at, because we already have a process where you have postal ballots, where our people in the armed forces and the paramilitary forces, they vote on ballot. So therefore, I'm sure that the same thing could possibly be extended to even NRIs who are settled abroad. That's an option which can be looked at seriously.
Sir, but I wonder...
I think you've had two questions.
Okay,
thank you very much. Sir.
Hi, Manish. I'm Atul from Global Schools Foundation. I think we met last time at the airport. My question is regarding the snooping business that is going on now. Actually, 5 years back, friends of ours who worked in Google told us personally that the federal agents were sitting there scanning all emails. And we find today these revelations are very much in the public domain. Many of the Indian bureaucrats, government officials, army, they all do business on Gmail and Yahoo. So is there any strategy for government to take them off that public platform so that confidential email can actually circulate in government domains only?
Thank you.
Well, it's an extremely important question. You see, the irony is that most of us, and I continue to use Hotmail, I'm one of the culprits in that process, really have nothing to hide in terms of what we communicate. So therefore, whether we are on Hotmail or Gmail, actually it is fairly kosher communication. But yes, after the revelations and the Ala affair, Snowden, Government of India has now put in place a policy whereby all government communications are being moved to a secure platform. So I think maybe over the next month or so, it will become mandatory for every public servant of a certain level to ensure that that official communication is then on a more secure and sanitized platform. But given the way we are, I imagine everybody would continue to maintain a parallel Gmail or a Hotmail account and continue with life the way it was.
Minister, if you'd excuse me, I'd like to take advantage of my position as chair to ask you a couple of questions myself. I know that you're you are very seriously interested in strategic matters yourself, and you're a long-time member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'd like to ask you two questions about regional strategic matters. And the first is that I think going back 20 years, we've been hearing a lot about India's Look East policy. And I wondered if you could say something about where the Look East policy is going and what its contemporary relevance is. And secondly, I wondered if you could say something about India's views of the US rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region, and whether, from an Indian perspective, that is stabilizing or destabilizing, or what you see as its impact on regional security.
Well, for that, you'll really have to go back to 1945, because post the Second World War, the entire stability and prosperity of Southeast Asia, all the way from Japan down to Australia, has been underpinned by this bed of this hub and spoke of security alliances, which the United States has had with countries of this region. Coupled with that, now of course we've seen the emergence of China, both as an economic power and now even as a military power in its right. So under those circumstances, with the economic dynamics and the strategic dynamics evolving very rapidly in both Southeast Asia and North Asia, it becomes an area of critical interest to us. So when we look at an engagement, we look at a relationship of equivalence with the major powers of Southeast Asia and North Asia: Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and of course China. And very robust engagement with the multilateral institutions that you've created in this region, the ASEAN, the ARF, the ARF Plus, the Pacific Forum. So I think we in South Asia, when we look east, have a lot to learn from the very, very robust multilateral arrangements that we've been able to create. So therefore, the Indian Look East policy is not only an extension of the cultural linkages that we've had in the past. It is not only about the economic benefit that we seek out of this relationship, but more syncretically, I think some of the structures which have been created in this region are very important in terms of their emulation for the continued stability and security of South Asia. So therefore, strategically, I think we have a lot to learn from the successes which this region has achieved. And on the US rebalance, I think people would be deluding themselves if they do not concede that the United States of America continues to remain not only the biggest outside balancer of strategic interests in various parts of the world, but is also a preeminent Asian power. So therefore, if there is a rebalance which is taking place at this point in time, we'll have to really see as to how the contours of that rebalance emerge, because would it just involve a shifting of assets from the Persian Gulf into the Western Pacific or the South China, the East China Sea? Or it would be a more philosophical orientation where the US would then engage more robustly and more vigorously outside the entire specter of bases and the stationing of troops all the way down to Australia. So I think from our perspective, a rebalance which is a strategic reality, and it is a strategic reality that we have to deal with. And we will continue to watch the evolution of this strategic reality very closely as it plays out over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. Minister, I'm afraid that we've we're running out of time. I know that there are some people whom I'm going to have to disappoint because there simply isn't time in this session for all of you to have the opportunity to ask questions, and I do apologize for that. But I'd like to thank you very much indeed for answering that range of questions from the audience. You answered, I think, with great frankness. And your lecture this morning and your answers to the questions have given the audience here in the Fullerton Hotel the chance to hear your viewpoint at first hand on India's current and future challenges in the political and economic and strategic spheres. And I'm very grateful for your answer to those last couple of questions that I asked. And so thank you.